Hello and welcome to our conference. My name is Olga Rafalska and together with Bülent Akman, I'll be your host for today. Please let me start by thanking our opening speakers for their insight. I think it's a good starting point for our further discussion.
Thank you, Olga. My name is Bülent Akman, and before we get started, we would like to briefly explain the structure of our conference. We will start with a panel discussion around the three speeches that you have just seen.
After which we will have lectures and discussions on two separate channels. Please take a look at the schedule on our website in order to choose the topics that interest you the most, and still you can easily switch between the channels.
We encourage everyone to actively participate and use the channel to ask questions in the chat. And questions that you write will be asked to our panelists.
Yes, but please keep in mind that the chat is a form of public record and will be archived. So please don't write anything you wouldn't want your mother to read. And now let's get back to our panel.
We are honored today to have with us Professor Iwona Kurz, representing the city of Warsaw.
Nice to meet you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
We also have Witold Naturski, head of the European Commission representation in Poland.
Good morning, actually deputy head. Hi.
And hi. And finally, we have Gerard Bast, representing the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. We welcome you all.
Morning.
Let's start with a question for Mr. Bast. You talk a lot about the technological change that is happening and in general the changes that face our society. And I was wondering, how do you think that the transfer to the virtual space will somehow influence the city, and is the city as physical space will become maybe irrelevant? What could you say about that?
Well, we all can realize sometimes we suffer from what is happening now in these months with our societies, when we are forced to step into the cyberspace, communicating online, while we rather would communicate in another way we did before, in a physical way. So we really realize the change, what happened not only to economy, but also to people, to us, how we feel. And I think we all can see that there is something missing. And in my statement, I mentioned what is a city? What makes a city a city? And in the core, it is about, it's kind of a marketplace, a laboratory for societal development. And a society is a society of people and not of machines or digital devices, at least so far. So when we know that in not too many years, in 2050, 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities, we have to realize that if we want to remain the developing power of the environment of a city, for humankind, that we have to keep up the communication, the trading of goods and ideas in an environment called city. And we have to provide the opportunities to do this. In the ancient city, a lot of people refer to these times. In the ancient city, the center of a city was the agora. And it was Hannah Arendt who once mentioned that the agora the place where people negotiated the development of their societies is necessary, not only for a city in terms of architecture, but for the people and for the existence of a human society in a city. So what's the focus of that? Of course, we will use technical environments. Of course, we will need to explore digital devices, and these are useful devices in certain times, but they never should and can replace human interaction.
Gerard, can I
Yes.
stop you there for a moment? Because I'd like to hear from Ivona, because you've touched on some very important points, but it seems like technology is going to play a large role in sustainable city design. And Ivona, would you like to respond to what Gerard said? What about creativity in city design?
I guess there is no conflict here, because what Gerard said in his keynote talk was power to the people, yes? So of course we can't forget the technology, it's obvious, and smart city is some kind of project that we have in mind. But of course, creativity and people and imagination. I'm here I was invited here as a co-author of the cultural policy for Warsaw that was accepted this year. And we started with some assumption about the diagnosis of nowadays. And this diagnosis is probably shared here. I mean, three most important global challenges: it's migration, climate crisis, and crisis of liberal democracy. But I would add to that something that is very visible in terms of political, social debate. This is the crisis of imagination or lack of imagination. We don't have serious proposals in terms of social or political projects on our table. And here culture goes and art goes. As a laboratory, again, I also use this word, for imagination, as a tool for diagnosis, and as a tool for making projects for future, as the one Mr. Prawda recalled in his the talk, the Dotleniacz by Joanna Rajkowska. But of course we can't, let's say, split between creative people and technology, because technology is something is our environment. We live in it, and it actually changes our behavior, the way we think. So we must beware, but also we must smartly use these tools.
Thank you, Ivona. Witold, Ivona has said that we suffer from a lack of imagination in finding sustainable solutions to city design. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, good morning. From the position of the European Commission, we try to get as concrete as it's possible. So perhaps the concept and the imagination we should leave to the lowest possible level of management, and we call that we use that rule in the European Union in whatever we do. So we leave things to be solved on the level they are solved the best way. But I'd like to mention that since my boss and colleague Marek Prawda already mentioned the Green Deal, this is the future for us all, not only in the cities, but for us all. And since Europe is well ahead the world in placing people or people being placed in urban areas, because as we heard in the world by 2050, 2/3 of people are going to live in the urban areas, and in Europe this is already the reality. Already 2/3 of Europeans live in the cities. 80% of the energy is consumed by the cities. 85% of the GDP of the European Union is produced in the cities. So the European Commission is very much aware, and has been for many years already, that the cities need support. How we can support the cities from the European Commission's perspective. As Rafał Trzaskowski mentioned, the mayor of Warsaw mentioned in his speech, the European Commission is first and foremost supporting cities via investments, via real and core investments, and also in terms of culture, because the infrastructure of culture, theaters, cinemas, places of culture, they all need infrastructure. Then the infrastructure is filled in by the projects of the people who live in the cities, by the authorities, by the mayors, by the citizens. But what the European Commission and the European Union can provide is the infrastructure, the needed investments. Also, it doesn't mean that we don't think about future in the planning sense of the future. So we also make plans. But as I said in the beginning, we leave what is to be solved on the best possible level to that level. So cohesion funds, as you know best, and the funds from the European Union budget that support poorer regions in the European Union, they are in more than half invested in urban areas, Europe-wide, not only in Poland, Europe-wide.
Thank you, Witold.
So this is what we do. Yes.
Gerard, would you like to say
Yes,
something?
thank you. So you just made me think about what is the reality of the European Union, and I have to say that I am a glowing supporter and friend of the European idea. But a few days ago, we heard and could read about a big negotiation in the European Union, and this was the agricultural budget. By far the largest part of the European Union budget. This was a big discussion, and you just said that now 2/3 of European people are living in cities and not on the flat land. And cities have different needs for an environment. And one of these needs is the cultural, the artistic environment. And I would really love to hear from the European Union to give the same emphasis on the cultural environment for cities, also in terms of budget, as the European Union gives to the agricultural environment for a city. I know this is a big discussion and goes to the ground of the treaties, but I think if we realize the change in our European societies from an agricultural society to an urban society, we also need to talk about what does this mean for the politics of the European Union.
Yes, well, as I said, we cannot disconnect the urban parts of Europe from the rural parts of Europe. And what we mentioning the agricultural reform and the agricultural budget, the core point of the future agricultural reform is the farm to fork strategy. What it means? It means something that many activists have already known for a long time, that the people who live in the city and they don't grow their own food, they buy their own food, should buy the food that is produced as close as possible to them. So linking, growing the foods for the city close to them in the rural areas, but as close to them, is also part of the link between those two. It has nothing to do with culture, but I'm just showing the link between and the importance of complementing those two areas. And as I said, with culture, cultural programs sponsored or co-sponsored by the European Union's budget do not limit themselves to the infrastructure of culture, which I mentioned before. They also support artists directly or indirectly with share management with the ministries of culture, for example, of respective countries. So there are quite a number of possibilities to be supported by the European Union. And I'm coming back to the money, because I know how important money is for the artists. My own brother is an actor, and I know how artists suffer, especially in the times of the pandemics. The theaters are closed. So programs supporting artists in the times of pandemics, but not only, are also vital, and they are also co-sponsored by the European Union's budget.
Yes, but what I wanted to say is that culture, arts, and education, these are core elements of urban environments. And these topics are not topics of European Union policy. These are still national topics. And this is what I want to question. If this can be the future of a European Union politics, if you separate the most important elements for the people who are living mainly in cities in the near future. So
that's a very good question.
We have to discuss about this. What is a matter of European Union politics if we realize that the center of societies or most people are living in cities? Of course,
that's a very good question.
To support, the food supply, but we also have to realize that the system of education, the system of culture and arts, is a necessary societal element.
As you rightly mentioned, just one more thing, because this is very important to be said here. As you rightly mentioned, the European Union, as an international organization owned by 27 national states, has certain prerogatives given it by those states, by the prime ministers, parliaments, and nations. So should you have such a comment, with which I agree as a European Commission official and privately also as well, the question should be asked to the prime ministers of 27 governments whether they want to derogate more of their powers to the European Union, and especially in that field, or not, because we can only do what the treaties say we do. And the treaties are set in the capitals, in the various cities, in the capitals of the countries.
I did raise this question in Austria, and I hope that some of the people who are looking at this conference have an idea how to make this happen, and it takes a long time, maybe the next years.
That's true.
I would like to come back a little to what Mr. Bast said about the radical change that we have to make because of the radical situations that we are facing in today's society, in the European Union, and in the whole world. I was thinking about how would you say the art should take this radical path in order to solve the problems that we are facing? Because I absolutely agree that the culture and art is a very important part of today's society, and I was wondering what does radical mean to you? And it's actually a question to all of you, because I absolutely agree that we need radical change, and we all can agree that it's not very simple to put in action those kinds of decisions that people are not necessarily happy about. Those, what kind of ideas would you have for a radical change that could somehow make a positive change? And
do you think we could have Ivana answer that question? Because you're here representing the city of Warsaw. I live in Warsaw, and I love living here. It has so much green space and opportunities for people to come together. I mean, Gerard Bast mentioned the Agora as being the center of community life in ancient times. I'm very lucky to live in a community where we have, Agora at the center. And so, Ivana, what can the city of Warsaw do to encourage more dramatic or radical change at the local level?
Especially, if I could add, especially in the times that we are facing right now, where we are not really able to go to this agora and represent ourselves. As we said, the technology is actually taking control of our lives, and we are all even now staring at our screens. So we are sitting at home, and so what action can we take?
Of course, it's not exactly the truth, because we know that this night there was some real agora in Warsaw. For political reasons, but yes, I mean, it's a good question. Is it possible to be radical in pandemic time? I think that I would start, because I'm represent here city of Warsaw, but I work at the university that actually we have very similar line of studies, like applied arts, let's say. And this is very important, that which is some kind of change in culture. That first of all, we need to think about it not as a cultural production, but as a kind of space for cultural participation, and as a way of mixing imagination, thought, theory with practice and activism. And this is the way, the first step, perhaps, to change this field of artistic and cultural activities. Because culture, what is important about culture and arts, that they actually change the way we think, may change the way we think. It may change the way we use our language. And this is the most important task, I would say. So, for example, when we speak about infrastructure, of course, we need it. Nevertheless, the economic situation. But first, we should ask what infrastructure and for which activities. And let me recall the problem we had actually in Poland, because this is, again, like we discussed earlier, the split between technology and people. And of course, we have also this split between infrastructure and hardware and software, let's say. This was a part of public political discussion in Poland, yes, that actually the former governments used to put accent on infrastructure, on hardware, and now we have a new government that gives us software. I'm not sure if we are all happy with that, but it shows that, again, we need also some kind of balance in this field. So first, we should think about what kind of infrastructure we need. And we also need to think in terms of social natural environment, the one that connects people and nature. This is the only way to start thinking about changes in this field of culture and arts. And again, because it was recalled, this Dotleniacz Oxygen Space by Joanna Rajkowska was a good example of the place that could be an agora, a small kind of agora in terms of local, joining social relations, local inhabitants of Plac Grzybowski, yes, and anything that was left from nature there. So I guess that in our thinking, we should just think about the frames in which artists could make the radical change, and I trust that they will do the job.
Thank you, Ivona. How can cities bring about, and this is a question to all of you, more civic spaces like Plac Grzybowski? For those of you who don't know, it's a small city square in Warsaw that offers some green space where people can sit at their leisure and just be out of their house with adequate social distancing, especially in these times, without feeling any pressure to spend money. Because very often when we step out of our house, there's a lot of pressure in the infrastructure in cities to participate in consumption and purchase commodities.
Let me just comment briefly on that. Let's think in what situation we are when we think that making small agora is revolutionary.
Right.
So that's the point we start, actually.
That's exactly what I was asking. Like, it doesn't really seem that radical, I think.
I mean, It
That's
shows,
why I asked about the radical answers to the questions. And like, it's a very nice project, and I think it raises awareness. But as we know what predictions do we have for the future, we have to act radically, and it's not very radical. Sorry.
If I may, can I? Well, as an inhabitant of the district of Wola, which is very close to the famous Plac Grzybowski we're speaking of now, I can only say that you cannot underestimate the role of the spatial planning in the cities. Wola is a historic district, one of the oldest in Warsaw, and it's totally left without any, the closed Wola, the part closer to the city center, is left without any green areas. And the last green areas occur to be in the spatial planning meant for buildings. So there is something you look at, you think it's a piece of a green square, and then you realize it's actually meant for being filled with buildings in the spatial planning. You cannot expect from the private investors not to use such an opportunity. So they buy those squares and they build. But it's this city's responsibility to do the spatial planning in such a way to leave places for people. And this is where the state steps in. The free economy is great, but this is where the state really needs to step in to say not everything that's left empty has to be meant for development. Sometimes it has to be left alone.
That's very well said, Witold, because highest and best use for developers is maximum profit to an individual to develop the space. But if you have an undeveloped space, there are tertiary economic benefits. I mean, how can we have social cohesion if there's no opportunity for people to cohere by simply sharing a space and having that space and feeling entitled to use that space just to exist and have those random accidents, meeting neighbors, unintended conversations. And I think we need more open civic spaces that are not temples of consumption in cities. Gerard, would you like to add some more?
I think this is a most important aspect. It brings us back to the question, what is a city? And the city is an environment for people. And the reason why investors are placing fancy business architecture in the center of a city is not because there are 20 or 50 other fancy buildings, but the reason is because there are people who makes the environment city interesting with science, with the arts, with culture, with trade, with communicating. This is the reason. And if people are expelled from the cities or from part of the city will die. We can see this in several areas, even in New York. I talked with an architect a few months ago, and he said the Wall Street district is totally changing because the tendency that there are no people living was already a massive tendency. But now the offices are reducing space because of automation and artificial intelligence. So they don't need so much office space. So people are in a lower scale going to these parts of the city to work. What is happening? They are making investments for people who don't neither work nor live in this part. So it is transforming into kind of a ghost city. And this is, again, not only against the city, but on the long run also against the investors, because nobody wants to buy an apartment in the ghost city. So I think this is all everything is coming together, and we have to secure that the most important elements of the city, trading goods and ideas, making arts and communicate between people, that these elements are maintaining, and we have to secure that these elements have enough room and space and environmental support to survive.
Thank you very much, Gerard. We have a question coming in from our audience, and the question is, how can we assure that private profit interests, like those of developers, can be aligned with those of the people? He goes on to say, should we use government municipal funds to ensure that public interests are secured, or is it possible to restructure the thinking of investors to act in a way that has some social responsibility in it? In simple terms, how can we balance the needs and interests of investors with the needs of the people who actually live in these communities? Concrete example, in my neighborhood, I live in Śródmieście in Warsaw. We have more and more office buildings being built while we still have office vacancies in existing buildings, which seems to me like someone is using real estate as a hedge against global currency volatility rather than actually building these buildings for people to actually use them.
Yeah, this is a topic for smart politics, smart urban politics, because on the long run, it is in the interest for politics and also in the interest for developers not to create a ghost city. It's not easy, I know, but in this case, it's especially necessary to have a look on the long-term perspectives. Of course, if you get a lot of money for a space and the city looks at tax revenues, it is interesting. But on the long run, if we make a city just a city without people, or parts of the city a city without people, this won't be not only a city for people anymore, but on the long run, it won't be a city for economy anymore and for culture. So this is what I meant in my statements with what are the scales and the competences we need to have in the future. We need to go away from this linear thinking. B follows A, and yes or no. We have an environment and a politics which is a network of different layers. And we should have in mind that from education on, we should make people possible to follow these network thinking, thinking in alternatives, not just thinking to the next step, which is a linear step. This is a kind of creative mindset I mentioned, and this is the most important thing we need to provide in education. And as you ask, what is radical? The radicality would be to change the mindset we provide with education, shifting it from what machines can do more and more to what only humankind can do and can think. And this is really a radical task for education?
Well, Gerard, let me stop you there because certainly education is key to changing the mindset of a generation of citizens living in the city. But the problem with developers is they're concerned only with the next quarter profits. And Witold alluded to urban planning and the intervention of the government, because only government has the power to look temporally across time for long-term consequences if it's so willing. So Witold, how can we incentivize urban planners to make development sustainable in the way that Gerard is describing, so we don't end up with a bank instead of a city?
Well, in my private opinion, first of all, we need to put a pressure on education of those people, because they are under tremendous. I mean, I'm meaning the officials working in the city hall or in the ministries. They're under tremendous pressure from the market and from the developers, who use all the best arguments they have, and they say, look, it's needed here, it's for the people, and blah blah blah, and so and so. As you rightly mentioned, they're only interested in the end of the year balance check, because they are liable before their shareholders, and they're also employed in the companies, so they don't care what's going to happen in 5 years, because in 5 years, most probably they would be working somewhere else. They care what's going to happen in December, yes, how the balance check is going to look like. So those who have, and then we have a situation when we have underpaid officials who have great powers, yes, because they do drafting of the spatial plans. Of course, then the city council decides, but the councillors, they're elected people, and they do not always know their jobs best, and it has to be said openly, because that's the drawbacks of democracy, that you elect people and they have a great mandate, but they are not always well skilled. But that's how the democracy works, and no better system was developed, so we have to live with that. So I would say we have to train the city councillors and the officials to show them, and then after such a training also they feel less responsible in a case that someone comes to them and says, why you said that this plot of land is meant for a park and not for a development, if a city could profit from the development itself. And then someone could be able to say, listen, you told me how important it is to have green areas within the city, so now don't ask such silly questions. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. We have to release pressure from the officials and from the lawmakers on the very city level, from the great capital. And if we release that pressure, that this would profit in good decisions.
Witold, let me stop you there, because I'd like to hear from Ivana on this question. Ivana, you just heard Witold's comments. What can we do to incentivize this process? Is there such an educational plan or trainings for urban planners in city government? Because Gerard alluded to the tertiary economic benefits of having these open spaces. You can't have economic activity in a ghost city, but you can't put that economic activity on a balance sheet. It's like towns in France on the TGV line in the high-speed rail. They have all kinds of economic benefits, but you can't record those benefits on the balance sheet of high-speed rail in France. It's not something you can document in a single organization. So is there such a training or education plan for the city of Warsaw?
If I could just add one point as well, because I'm the organizer of different design conferences, and one of them is especially for urban planning, and I have the experience of inviting. It has tickets. You have to pay for it, and we invited free. I personally called a lot of city planners and all the departments of different cities in the whole in our country, and to be honest, no one was interested, and I'm sure that the people would be interested in it, but it wasn't possible for them to actually put time from their job to educate themselves. So I would say that maybe we should have the, you know, the education a little bit up the ladder, and for people to actually give the opportunities and the idea that it's important for them to educate, and you have the time in your work to actually invest in this kind of education, which is obviously, we can agree, very important.
I think this is the most important point you just brought up, because of course, I guess we all agree that the education is the most crucial point, but how to make people willing to educate themselves. They are busy, and sometimes they just don't see the reason why actually they know everything about investment, for example, yes, or about architecture. So the tools that the city could have, I think, are rather soft tools. One is just trying, even if it fails, conferences, workshops, meeting different environments, different group of people, proving that this kind of contact, that this kind of discussion, that this kind of exchange is profitable for all parties involved. The other is maybe not so soft, but of course it's not so easy to use it on this highest level of investments. But in every aspect, every level of law, agreements, contracts, where the city has anything to say, that should be some conditions. On the very small level, we may say, for example, when you want to have your small bar in any of city facilities, you need to stop use you need to be ecological, yes? And this is something that could be actually put into the contracts. So I guess that this may be maybe some tool to show that just to make some good practices
Yes, indeed.
Obligatory.
I believe, Gerard, you wanted to add something?
I think part of the job of a politician is to take risks by looking into the future more than 3 or 4 years. And I'm an optimistic, and I do see that it is possible. For example, the city politicians of Copenhagen gave back large parts of the city to the citizens. And why did they do that? Because there was, on one side, Ivona, you are totally right, pressure by the people, but on the other side, the city had expertise, high-level expertise. In this case, it was Jan Gehl, an urbanist from high ranking, and politicians need such kinds of forward-looking expertise, and universities have to provide and develop these kinds of expertise, not only in one single disciplines, but expertise combining different areas, different disciplines. So we made a small step in this direction by creating this field in teaching and research called social design, art as urban innovation. And we increasingly are asked by politics, what could I do to make a better city for the people, and not only for economy. And what we realize now in times of epidemics, look at what happens in Brussels. Large part of the city were reduced from traffic. What happens in Paris? The same tendency. So I think this is a question of politics which is taking risks for the means and the future of the people. And the two components are they have to be supported by the pressure of the people or large parts of the people. And on the other hand, they have to have good expertise on their side.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. Unfortunately, we have only time for one more question, which I would like to address to all of you. What is the best piece of advice that you could give to cities to make them more sustainable?
Yes, I'd like to hear the answer from all of you as well. What is the best piece of advice you can give us regarding sustainable city design? If you had to give us one. Witold, would you like to go first?
Yes, well, from the Polish perspective, I would say look at the good and bad examples from the rest of the Europe, because there are certainly many many good and bad examples, and it's better to not to do the same mistakes, and it's good to follow the best example.
That's a good point. I'd like to see what the city of Stockholm did with its heating and cooling happen in Warsaw too. That would be excellent. Ivana, what is the best piece of advice you can give us regarding sustainable city design?
I would say listen to the people, do all the changes with the people.
And have more people vote. So if they don't like the choices, they can vote new representatives.
Yeah.
Yes. Gerard, what about you?
Yeah, I agree to all of you, especially listen to the people, but my special request would be make people who have this creative mindset part of city planning in an institutional way. Give not only the voice to people from technology, experts from traffic, from transport, from economy, give a voice to people who have this creative mindset, who are able and willing to look and think out of the box.
Yes, and I think we will see a lot of examples of those kinds of creative minds today. So I encourage you to stay with us, because there will be a lot of good examples of creatives and also researchers working together in multidisciplinary teams, working together with cities. So I guess we can just learn from those good examples.
Well, if you'll indulge me to share one wish with you, I would like to teach urban planning to primary school children. If there was some way we could do that and sensitize them at an age when they're really impressionable about the impacts and non-obvious consequences of urban planning, I think that would be great. If they could do it in a fun way, that would be even better.